Hello everyone, my name is Ketan and I'm the faculty of Indian Economy at UPSCprep.com. Now UPSC likes to ask a lot of application-based questions for Indian economy, like especially those related to fiscal policy or monetary policy or exchange rates. So these questions are like the kind of, if there is recession, what steps should the government take? Then there will be four statements and you have to pick the correct statements. Or if there is high inflation, how would RBI change its monetary policy? Or if the US Federal Reserve increases its interest rate, how would that affect the exchange rate in India, right? So I went through all the previous year questions and I found that from 2013 onwards, UPSC has asked 16 such questions, right? So on an average, UPSC has been asking two such questions every year. Now, if you have conceptual clarity, then these questions are very easy to solve, right? So to enhance your conceptual clarity, I have created a few cheat sheets, which we'll look at in this video. And hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have more conceptual clarity to tackle these kind of questions and hopefully get a few extra marks in your prelims examination. Okay, so let's start with the monetary policy cheat sheet. Now, RBI को अपना monetary policy change करने का जरूरत कब पड़ेगा? When there is a problem with the economy, right? So either the economy is too hot, which means the inflation rates are high, or the economic activities has gone down, which means there is recessionary tendencies, high unemployment, and the economy has become too cold. तब वहाँ पे RBI will implement an expansionary monetary policy. So in this cheat sheet, this is the cheat sheet for expansionary monetary policy. We have identified the problem. The problem is recession, which means either a stagnated GDP or a decrease in GDP and increase in unemployment. Okay. So in this case, RBI क्या करना चाहेगी? RBI would like to increase the aggregate demand in the economy. So the goal for the aggregate demand is increase. So जब aggregate demand बढ़ जाएगा, so तब investment भी बढ़ेगा, more economic activities will start taking place, right? So this will kickstart the economic recovery. So the policy adopted by the RBI is expansionary monetary policy to increase the money supply. तो aggregate demand कब बढ़ेगा? जब money supply बढ़ेगा economy में, and lower the interest rates so that it becomes cheaper for the banks to borrow from the RBI. तो जब बैंक को लोअर रेट पे पैसा मिलेगा तो फर्दर बैंक विल ऑल्सो लोन आउट मनी एट लोअर रेट्स, right? Now, what are the tools available for RBI? So RBI has three kinds of tools. First is reserve ratios, so CRR and SLR, right? तो इसको कम करना पड़ेगा CRR and SLR को, so that banks have to keep aside less amount of money as reserves, and the banks will be left with more money to loan. Second is policy rates. Policy rates भी RBI कम करेगी. So policy rates like repo rate, reverse repo rate, MSF, SDF, वो सारा कम करना पड़ेगा so that it becomes cheaper for banks to borrow from RBI. अगर बैंक को कम दाम में पैसा मिलेगा RBI से, then further they'll also give more loans at cheaper rates. Okay. And the third tool RBI has is direct intervention in the market. How can RBI directly intervene? Through buying and selling of bonds, right? So in this case, because आरबीआई का गोल है कि मनी सप्लाई बढ़ाना है मार्केट में, सो आरबीआई विल बाय बॉन्ड्स. जब बॉन्ड्स बाय करेगी तो पैसा देगी मार्केट में एंड डायरेक्टली मनी सप्लाई बढ़ेगा, राइट? सो इन दिस केस गवर्नमेंट इज इंक्रीजिंग द मनी सप्लाई डायरेक्टली इन द इकोनॉमी. Okay, so this is the policy undertaken by RBI, the expansionary monetary policy. What will happen to the money with the banks for loans? That will increase because number one, reserve ratios कम हो गए, so bank has to keep aside lesser amount of money, lower reserve requirements, but at the same time borrowing from the RBI is easier because the interest rates are low. So now banks have more resources to offer loans. What will happen to the money supply? Money supply will increase, right? Because banks are giving out more loans. At the same time, RBI is also buying bonds, which means injecting money, right? Buying bonds is injecting money in the economy, and banks is also offering more loans. What happens to the bank's interest rate? Because see, now the banks are getting loans at lower rates from RBI. तो बैंक को भी वो जो benefit है वो extend करना पड़ेगा to its customers. So banks' interest rates will also decrease. right? So lower policy rates leads to lower lending rates, making the loans cheaper. What's happened to the bond prices? Because government is buying a lot of bonds, open market operations say, right? Now, buying bonds by RBI raises prices because bonds का डिमांड बढ़ गया. जब भी किसी प्रोडक्ट का या सर्विस का डिमांड बढ़ जाता है तो उसका प्राइस भी बढ़ जाता है. सो बॉन्ड्स प्राइस हैज इंक्रीज्ड. So what happens to the bond yield? Bond yield is the returns you are getting on the bonds, right? So suppose you have bought a 1,000 rupee bond and usme you have a coupon rate of suppose 50 rupees. So this 50 rupees is the return you are getting. Now this 1,000 rupee bond ka price increase ho gaya hai, right? This 1,000 rupee bond is now 1,010 rupees. So now your yield will decrease from 50 rupees to 40 rupees. So there is an inverse relationship between bond price and the bond yield. So bond yield will decrease in this case. Okay. Now what happens to consumption and investment in the economy? Because now loans are available at cheaper rates, there is higher money supply, so consumption increases and investment increases, right? So lower interest rates, greater loan availability, boost spending and capital investments. Next is what happens to the capital formation in the economy. So what is capital formation? It is the machinery that the factories are buying, factories are being set up, infrastructure is being built, more roads, more railways, more warehouses, more hospitals, more schools, right? That is capital formation. Now the money supply has increased, the economic activity is growing, so the capital formation is also increasing, right? More investment means more capital goods, more infrastructure. What happens to aggregate demand? Now, this was the goal of the RBI when it adopted expansionary monetary policy. The aggregate demands increased, right? Because there is now more consumption and more investment in the economy. What happens to GDP? GDP will also increase. Economic activity बढ़ गया है. There is higher output. There is higher economic growth. What happens to price levels? Now, see, economic activities has increased. There is more demand. Now the demand, if the supply is not able to keep up with the demand, then the prices will also increase. Because increased money supply and demand can lead to inflationary pressures. Now prices increased, that means that inflation is high, right? Now inflation is high. What is the effect on unemployment? Now, unemployment generally, when there is higher economic activities happening, then there is more job opportunities, more and more people are investing, opening up new businesses. So unemployment decrease hoga. So this was the goal of the expansionary monetary policy. Now, what are the effects on the forex market? Forex market में exchange rate में क्या होगा? Demand of rupee, what will happen to the demand of rupee? So see, in the market, the interest rates are low, the bond yields are low. Okay, so to a foreign investor, now foreign investor will look at his own returns on his investment, his own interest कि भाई मेरे को कितना return मिल रहा है. Now interest rate is low, the bond yields are low, then it is not very lucrative for a foreign investor to invest in India. So the demand for rupee will decrease. Now once the demand for rupee decreases, then rupee will depreciate. So the exchange rate, the rupee will depreciate because there is low demand for rupee. So what happens to the net exports? See, once the rupee has depreciated, then the import bill will increase because for buying the same amount of goods from a foreign country, you have to spend a larger amount of rupees. तो imports महंगा हो गया, लेकिन exports will become cheaper. Once the exports become cheaper, exports become more competitive in the international market. इसका मतलब उसका exports का demand बढ़ जाएगा, right? So weaker currency makes exports cheaper and more competitive. So potentially increasing the exports. So exports has increased, imports has decreased. So next step, exports, which is exports minus imports, has increased. Okay, so what are the benefits of expansionary policy? GDP went higher, Unemployment decreased because the money supply was high, the net aggregate demand was high, but there are side effects, right? What are the side effects? There is high inflation and there is depreciation of rupee. Let's come to contractionary monetary policy. So here we have identified the problem is high inflation. So once there is high inflation, that is also not desirable for the economy because high inflation erodes the purchasing power of the rupee, right? So we always want inflation to be under control. Now RBI always targets that the inflation should be 4% plus minus 2% के range में होना चाहिए, right? So if the inflation is higher than 6%, then RBI will implement a contractionary monetary policy. So the goal for aggregate demands becomes that the money supply should be decreased or aggregate demand should be decreased, which will help in moderating inflation. What is the policy? Now RBI will adopt a contractionary monetary policy to reduce the money supply in the economy so that the demand decreases. एक बार demand कम हो जाएगा तो inflation भी कम हो जाएगा. They will increase the interest rates, right? Now again, these tools, three tools of RBI comes into play. First is the reserve ratio. Now this time RBI will increase the reserve ratio. So banks have to keep aside a larger amount with them in form of either cash or government securities or gold. So banks are now left with lesser amount to loan. बैंक के पास कम पैसा बचेगा लोन करने के लिए. What will happen to the policy rates like repo rates or MSF, SDF? This time RBI will increase the policy rates. So borrowing becomes expensive for the bank. Borrowing becomes expensive, then banks will borrow a lesser amount from RBI. In turn, they will also increase the rate of borrowing for the consumers or customers. अब कस्टमर्स को एक्सपेंसिव लोन मिल रहा है तो दे विल कम लोन लेंगे वो बैंक से, राइट? थर्ड इज द डायरेक्ट इंटरवेंशन ऑफ आरबीआई इन द मार्केट. नाउ आरबीआई का क्या है कि इस बार द मनी सप्लाई हैज टू बी डिक्रीज्ड. तो डिक्रीज करने के लिए आरबीआई विल सेल बॉन्ड्स. सेल करने से क्या होगा? दे विल सेल बॉन्ड्स एंड suck out money from the economy. So the government is directly decreasing the money supply. Okay. So through these three tools, RBI will exercise a contractionary monetary policy. What happens to the money with banks? वो कम हो जाएगा because reserve requirement is high, interest rates are high. So banks has lesser money to loan out. What happens to money supply? Now bank is loaning out less money. So the money supply has decreased. Also, government or the RBI is selling bonds. So selling bonds withdraws money. Also, high interest rates makes loan expensive. Okay. What happens to the bank's interest rate? Now, bank's interest rates, it directly depends on the RBI's interest rate. RBI ने interest rate बढ़ा दिया तो बैंक का interest rate भी बढ़ जाएगा. Okay. So now the loans are expensive. Bonds prices क्या होगा? Now the RBI is selling bonds. So the supply of bond is high. The demand may not be that much. So bonds prices will decrease. Okay. And when the bonds prices decreases, bond yields increases because there is an inverse relationship between bond price and bond yield. Okay. Now what happens to consumption and investment in the economy? Money supply कम है, लोन लोगों को कम मिल रहा है, तो consumption and investment both will decrease. Okay. This will have a direct impact on capital formation in the economy. So lesser buying of capital goods, lesser setting up of factories, lesser investment, lesser building of infrastructure, everything will decrease. The aggregate demand, जो goal था RBI का, that aggregate demands कम हो जाएगा, right? Because there is reduced consumption, there is reduced investment. The GDP may also decrease or grow more slowly, right? So the rate of growth of GDP will definitely come down because the economic activities has slowed down. There is lower aggregate demand, causing a temporary contraction in GDP or slow down, at least slow down in the increase of GDP. So GDP growth तो definitely कम होगा. प्राइस लेवल्स कम होगा या तो स्टेबलाइज हो गया या डिक्रीज होगा प्राइस लेवल्स, बिकॉज अगेन प्राइस इज डिपेंडेंट ऑन डिमांड एंड सप्लाई, राइट? डिमांड घट गया तो प्राइस भी घट गया. Now price levels has started decreasing, so there is decrease in inflation for sure. What happens to unemployment? Because there is lesser economic activities happening in the economy, the unemployment now has increased. क्योंकि कंजम्पशन कम है, इन्वेस्टमेंट कम है, तो डिमांड कम है. नाउ डिमांड कम होगा तो सप्लाई भी will act accordingly, and people, factories or industries will start laying out workers. So unemployment will increase. Now what is the effect on forex market? Now from the point of view of a foreign investor, the interest rate is high, the bond yields are high, so the returns on their investment will be high, right? So it becomes attractive for a foreign investor to invest in the Indian economy. So the demand of rupee will increase. Once the demand of rupee increases, there is appreciation in the exchange rate, right? What happens to net exports? Now, since there is appreciation of rupee, the imports become cheaper and exports become more expensive. Once the exports become expensive, तो बाहर दूसरी कंट्रीज कम एक्सपोर्ट, कम चीजें खरीदेंगे इंडिया से, राइट? सो द एक्सपोर्ट माइनस इंपोर्ट will decrease. Okay, so what is the benefit of contractionary policies? Benefit hai that your inflation has decreased. So that was the prime problem that RBI was trying to tackle. तो inflation कम हो गया, लेकिन there are side effects, right? Growth rate भी कम हो जाएगा, unemployment बढ़ेगा. Next, let's come to the fiscal policy cheat sheet. So again, a lot of things will remain same. That the problem we are tackling is recession, right? And the problem जब recession होता है तो the government will adopt a expansionary fiscal policy, right? Problem is economic downturn or recession. Now it necessitates a government intervention, right? क्योंकि recession का है तो government को कुछ करना पड़ेगा. What does the government want to do is increase the aggregate demand to kickstart the economic recovery, lower the unemployment rates. What is the policy that the government will adopt is an expansionary fiscal policy, which means increasing the aggregate demand in the economy or increasing the money flow in the economy. Now, what are the tools available for the government? Now, when we saw the monetary policy, तो वहाँ RBI के पास तीन तरह के टूल थे. Either increase or decrease the reserve ratio, or increase or decrease the policy rates, या फिर direct intervention with buying and selling of bonds, open market operations. The government of India has two tools: either increase or decrease the government spending, या फिर taxes, जो taxes collect करते हैं, right? तो अब expansionary monetary policy में government will increase government spending. Why will the government increase government spending? Because it will directly boost the economic activity, because government जो purchasing है, government investment has increased, government is building more roads, more railways, more warehouses, schools, ये सब, तो उससे net demand create होगा, more employment will be generated, right? Second is taxes. Taxes government will decrease. Why will the government decrease taxes? Because you as a person, अगर तुमको कम tax देना पड़ रहा है, then you have more disposable income in your hand, तो तुम ज़्यादा demand करोगे, right? So increased disposable income enables higher consumer and business spending, right? So these are the two tools. What happens to the aggregate demand? Aggregate demand बढ़ जाएगा because now money is injected in the economy. Because of decrease of taxes, there is more money in the hands of consumers. This will lead to increase in GDP क्योंकि economic activity बढ़ गया है, spending ज़्यादा हो रहा है, investment ज़्यादा हो रहा है, right? Price levels का क्या होगा? जब भी मनी सप्लाई बढ़ता है तब तक प्राइस भी बढ़ता है ना? Because now there is more demand. If the supply is not able to keep up with the demand, the prices will increase. Now prices increase, which means inflation also increases. What happens to unemployment? Unemployment will decrease because economic activities has increased. More economic activity means more jobs. So unemployment has decreased. Now what happens to budget deficit होगा या budget surplus होगा? Not talking about the government budget, right? Now the government spending has increased. Spending has increased, but the tax revenue has decreased क्योंकि taxes कम किया है. So which means the government will have to borrow a larger amount. ज़्यादा borrow करेंगे मतलब deficit बढ़ जाएगा, budget deficit will increase, है ना? There will be widening of deficit. What happens to the debt? Debt is the amount that the government has borrowed. So that also increases because once you have presented a deficit budget, तो deficit को close करने के लिए और cover deficit को cover करने के लिए you will have to borrow either from your domestic sources or foreign sources, है ना? What happens to the loanable funds? Loanable funds का क्या होगा? See, first the demands for funds has increased. Right? The demand for funds has increased because the government spending has increased. Now there is less unemployment. Unemployment कम हो गया है तो people will demand more and more. But the supply of funds has decreased. Supply of fund decrease हो जाएगा क्योंकि the government has drained the funds. The government ने इतना borrow कर लिया है मार्केट से कि किसी और के पास बचा नहीं है कुछ borrow करने के लिए, right? Increased government borrowing can reduce the availability of loan for the private sector. Private sector के लिए loan लेने के लिए कुछ पैसा बचा नहीं है मार्केट में, right? What happens in the money market? Money market is the short term market, right? उसमें there is higher demand of money क्योंकि government is borrowing more and more. Government इतना borrow कर रही है तो वहां पे demand for money will increase. Now this will have effect on the interest rates क्योंकि demand and supply का सारा game है ना? तो interest rate increase हो जाएगा because the demand is high. High demand for fund combined with low supply of fund will drive up the interest rate. What happens to private investment? Because government is investing, then private investment would also want, they would also want to do private investment, lekin there is no availability of funds. So private investment has decreased. Less availability of funds for private sector will lead to a phenomena that is known as crowding out. So this is crowding out. When government spending increases, government will suck out lot of funds in the market, and now the private and there is no availability of funds for the private sector. Okay, let's see what happens in the foreign exchange market. Now, foreign exchange market, now thinking from a perspective of a foreign investor. Foreign investor तभी invest करेगा तुम्हारी country में when the interest rates are high, है ना? Now here we are saying that the interest rates are indeed high, right? So the demand for rupee will increase. High interest rates becomes a lucrative investment for foreign investors. Now demand has increased, which means rupee will appreciate. So rupee will appreciate. Now once the rupee has appreciated, your exports become expensive, your imports become cheaper. So exports minus imports, that is the net exports, also decreases, right? So what are the benefits of your expansionary fiscal policy? GDP बढ़ गया है, unemployment घट गया है, but there are side effects, right? There is inflation, there is crowding out. The private sector is no longer able to find funds from the market because government ने सारा funds borrow कर लिया है, and there is net exports which will decrease. Next, let's look at the contractionary fiscal policy. Now, what is the problem we have identified here? Is that there is high inflation or high fiscal deficit. Now, high inflation is an issue because high inflation will erode the purchasing power of rupee. So that is not desirable in an economy. So now the goal for the government will be to decrease the aggregate demand because aggregate demand कम करेंगे तो थोड़ा cool down होगा economy में and inflation control में आ जाएगा. Policy that the government will adopt here is a contractionary fiscal policy aimed at reducing the money supply. ना मनी सप्लाई करने के लिए जो दो टूल्स है गवर्नमेंट के पास, गवर्नमेंट स्पेंडिंग एंड टैक्सेस, उसका क्या होगा? सो मनी सप्लाई कम करना है, सो देयर विल बी डिक्रीज इन गवर्नमेंट स्पेंडिंग एंड इंक्रीज इन टैक्सेस। गवर्नमेंट स्पेंडिंग डिक्रीज किया तो इट विल हैव अ डायरेक्ट इम्पैक्ट ऑन द इकोनॉमी, इकोनॉमी में पैसा कम हो जाएगा। और टैक्सेस बढ़ा दिया, सो देयर इज लेस डिस्पोजेबल इनकम तुम्हारा। इफ योर लार्जर चंक ऑफ योर इनकम इज टेकन बाय द गवर्नमेंट एज टैक्सेस, देन यू हैव लेसर मनी अवेलेबल विथ यू टू स्पेंड और इन्वेस्ट इन द मार्केट। ओके, सो व्हाट हैपेंस टू एग्रीगेट डिमांड? एग्रीगेट डिमांड कम हो गया है क्योंकि मनी सप्लाई कम है, कंज्यूमर के हाथ में पैसा कम है। GDP will also decrease because now the economic activities has slowed down, इन्वेस्टमेंट कम हो रहा है, स्पेंडिंग कम हो रहा है। अब जब डिमांड कम हो गया तो प्राइस लेवल्स विल बी ऑल्सो लोअर। प्राइस लोअर, लोअर प्राइस लेवल्स मीन्स inflation has decreased. Okay, what is the effect on unemployment? Lesser economic activities are happening, so lesser demand for jobs, lesser creation of new jobs, so unemployment will increase. What happens to, either there is budget deficit or surplus? Now here the government spending has decreased and the government tax revenue has increased, so there is surplus, right? Less government expenditure, high tax revenue. What happens to the national debt? National debt कम हो जाएगा because now the government has to borrow a lesser amount, या फिर अगर surplus हो गया तो कुछ debt repay कर देगी गवर्नमेंट, है ना। लोनेबल फंड्स का क्या हुआ? नाउ द गवर्नमेंट इज नॉट बोरोइंग एज मच, है ना। देयर इज डिक्रीज इन गवर्नमेंट बोरोइंग, सो इंक्रीज इन द सप्लाई ऑफ फंड्स, which means more funds available for private sector borrowing. What happens in the money market? Money market में again the government is not borrowing as much, so lower demand for money. अगर डिमांड फॉर मनी कम हो गया मनी मार्केट में तो इंटरेस्ट रेट विल डिक्रीज। ओके, this will lead to greater private investment because now एक private investor के लिए there is money available in the market, interest rate भी कम हो गया, so you will be able to borrow and invest, है ना। So there is availability of funds at lower interest rates leading to crowding in. So this phenomena is known as crowding in. What are the factors that is affecting the forex market? Foreign exchange market में क्या हुआ? इंटरेस्ट रेट लो है। नाउ फ्रॉम द पर्सपेक्टिव ऑफ फॉरेन इन्वेस्टर, लो इंटरेस्ट रेट है, इज नॉट फाइंडिंग द मार्केट एज लुक्रेटिव क्योंकि रिटर्न्स नहीं मिलेगा, सो द डिमांड फॉर रूपी विल डिक्रीज, सो देयर विल बी डेप्रिशिएशन इन टर्म्स ऑफ एक्सचेंज रेट। वंस डेप्रिशिएशन हुआ, सो योर इंपोर्ट्स बिकम एक्सपेंसिव, एक्सपोर्ट्स बिकम चीपर। एक्सपोर्ट्स चीपर हो गया तो ज्यादा डिमांड आएगा इंटरनेशनल मार्केट से, तो एक्सपोर्ट्स बढ़ जाएगा। This will lead to net increase in exports. Okay, so what are your benefits of contractionary policy? इन्फ्लेशन कम हो गया है, बजट डेफिसिट कम हुआ, इन्फ्लेशन कम हुआ, बट एट द सेम टाइम ड्यू टू कॉन्ट्रैक्शनरी फिस्कल पॉलिसी अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट बढ़ गया, क्राउडिंग इन हुआ है। दिस इज अ साइड इफेक्ट, दिस इज नॉट नेसेसरली अ नेगेटिव साइड इफेक्ट। क्राउडिंग इन इज अ गुड थिंग अगर प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट बढ़ रहा है, बट और नेट एक्सपोर्ट्स भी इंक्रीज हुआ, सो दिस इज ऑल्सो अ पॉजिटिव साइड इफेक्ट। ऑलराइट, नेक्स्ट लेट्स लुक एट द exchange rate cheat sheet, right? So in the first column we have various factors which affect the exchange rate, and then we'll see how there is appreciation or depreciation of Indian rupees. Okay, so first let's talk about interest rates. Agar interest rates in the bank interest rates has increased, which means for a foreign investor it becomes more lucrative to invest in the Indian market. अगर फॉरेन इन्वेस्टर्स इंडियन मार्केट में इन्वेस्ट करेंगे तो देयर विल बी एप्रिसिएशन, राइट। सो हायर इंटरेस्ट रेट्स लीड्स टू एप्रिसिएशन। सिमिलरली अगर लोअर इंटरेस्ट रेट्स होगा तो इट इज नो लॉन्गर लुक्रेटिव फॉर अ फॉरेन इन्वेस्टर टू इन्वेस्ट इन द इंडियन मार्केट, सो देयर विल बी डेप्रिसिएशन। टॉकिंग अबाउट इन्फ्लेशन रेट, अगर इन्फ्लेशन रेट हाई है विच मीन्स high inflation rate will erode the purchasing power of the Indian rupee. Now Indian rupee is no longer attractive, so वहां पे depreciation होगा। लेकिन अगर lower interest rate रहा तो it will increase the purchasing power of Indian rupee. So it is more attractive for a foreign investor to invest in India. So it will lead to appreciation, right? Let's talk about economic growth. If our economy is experiencing economic growth, then more and more investor will want to become a part of that economic growth because unka returns on investment will also increase, right? This will lead to increase in the demand for Indian rupee. So strong economic growth leads to appreciation, and weak economic growth leads to depreciation. Let's talk about trade balance. अगर trade surplus हुआ, right? Trade surplus means exports is greater than imports, right? Now, whenever you are exporting, which means that a foreign buyer has to procure Indian rupees, तभी तो वो इंडिया का सामान खरीद पाएगा, right? तो अगर trade surplus है, which means the demand for Indian rupee is very high, right? और जब demand for Indian rupee will be high, then there will be appreciation. Similarly, अगर trade deficit हुआ, then imports is greater than exports, right? So the demand for Indian rupee is lower in that case, and there is depreciation. Next, let's talk about speculation. Now, speculation is that what a investor or a trader believes कि future में क्या होगा, right? So if there is positive speculation that for an investor को लग रहा है कि in future the rupee will appreciate, so he will buy more and more rupee because उसको पैसा बनाने का है, right? And once he's buying rupee, then demand is also increasing, right? So positive in speculation leads to appreciation, negative speculation leads to depreciation. Next is political stability. किसी कंट्री में political stability है, right? तो वहां पे इन्वेस्टमेंट अट्रैक्ट होता है क्योंकि फॉर एन इन्वेस्टर, फ्रॉम एन इन्वेस्टर पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू, यू हैव कॉन्फिडेंस कि यस दिस कंट्री इज पॉलिटिकली वेरी स्टेबल, तो वहां पे इन्वेस्ट करेंगे तो श्योर शॉर्ट रिटर्न्स आई विल गेट, राइट? So there is political stability, so there is appreciation. Whereas in some country there is political instability, now the investor is no longer confident to invest in that country, तो वहां पे depreciation होगा, right? Next is central bank intervention. The RBI, अगर RBI करेंसी खरीदेगी, if the RBI starts to buy Indian rupees, so demand for Indian rupees will grow, which will lead to appreciation. Now, if the RBI has started selling off Indian rupees and buying dollars, which means the supply of Indian rupee has grown in the market and the demand is not as much, so there is depreciation. Next, what happens when there is inflow of FDI, or foreign direct investment in the economy? So when there is inflow of FDI, which means a foreign investor is investing in the country. अगर इंडिया में इन्वेस्ट करना है तो रुपी में करना पड़ेगा, सो देयर इज हाई डिमांड ऑफ रुपी. हाई डिमांड ऑफ रुपी मींस एप्रिशिएशन. सिमिलरली अगर एफडीआई, देयर इज आउटफ्लो ऑफ एफडीआई, व्हिच मींस कि इंडिया से पैसा वापस ओरिजिन कंट्री में जा रहा है, राइट? सो देयर इज लेस डिमांड फॉर रुपी, सप्लाई ऑफ रुपी बढ़ जाएगा, सो देयर इज डेप्रिशिएशन. Next is market sentiment and confidence. Now this is very similar to speculation. Speculation may be when you have positive speculation, which means you are confident about the economy, right? So अगर positive sentiment है, which means that everyone believes that the economy is going to do very good, so there will be increase in demand of that currency, so there will be appreciation. अगर negative sentiment है तो decrease in demand of the currency होगा और depreciation होगा. Okay. Next is global events and geopolitical risks, right? So whenever a major geopolitical event happens, suppose there is a war or there may be a pandemic, right? So in such situations, countries which are safe haven, right? जब लोगों को लगता है कि इस कंट्री को कुछ नहीं होगा, right? This country will remain quite stable. So investors will want to spend in those countries, right? So countries which are given a safe haven status, वहां पे appreciation होगा, whereas countries which are impacted by this global event, वहां पे negative impact हुआ, uncertainties हुआ, तो there will be decrease in demand of those currencies and वहां पे depreciation होगा. right? Next is relative strength of other currencies. Now, this is very important because exchange rate में there is two currencies involved. एक currency तो है नहीं. So when we are talking about rupee in terms of dollar, तो we are talking about dollars or rupee both. तो इंडिया में जो होता है उस पर डिपेंड तो करेगा ही, बट ऑल्सो व्हाट इज हैपनिंग इन यूएस दैट विल ऑल्सो इम्पैक्ट द एक्सचेंज रेट, राइट? सो अगर स्ट्रॉन्गर रिलेटिव परफॉर्मेंस है तो परफॉर्मेंस रिलेटिव टू द अदर कंट्री, तो अगर इंडिया का इकोनॉमिक एक्टिविटी इज परफॉर्मिंग much higher than the economic activities or economy of US, then people would want to invest in India, right? तो एक stronger relative performance रहेगा, तब appreciation होगा उस country के currencies का, whereas there is weaker relative performance, then there is depreciation. Then next is government debt levels. Government का debt level कितना है? For an investors, looking at the debt level is very important, because through that they understand that how robust is the economy of that country. अगर debt level manageable है, then that is the indication of strong economy. Whereas अगर debt level बिल्कुल बहुत ज़्यादा आ गया, तो that country may even face currency crisis, balance of payment crisis, right? So lower government debt levels means there is fiscal responsibility, which leads to increase in demand for that country's currency. So यहाँ पे appreciation होगा, whereas higher government debt will raise concerns for the investors, and फिर वहाँ पे invest करना नहीं चाहेंगे, तो demand for those currencies will drop and there will be depreciation. Next is capital flows. So we have already talked about FDI. FDI is also kind of capital flow. Whenever there is inflow of capital, which means your country's currency demand is growing, inflow of capital means appreciation, outflow of capital means depreciation, right? And last is government policies. A lot of these exchange rate will depend on the government policies also. If the government policy is pro-growth, which means that instills a level of confidence in the investor that yes, the country is going to grow and therefore we must invest in that country. So pro-growth policies increases confidence and demand for the currency. So there is appreciation. Whereas policies which are perceived as detrimental, right? Like populist policies, a lot of freebies, a lot of subsidies, a lot of, kind of policies which are seen mainly in election years. Okay? So those are not very pro-growth. They are more, they increases the deficit levels of the government. They increases the net national debt, because government is borrowing too much to invest in areas which are not as productive, like subsidies or too much welfare or freebies, right? So these kind of policies leads to decrease in confidence to an investor, and once there is decrease in confidence, they will not invest as much. तो यहाँ पे depreciation होगा. Okay. So this was the cheat sheets. These were the various cheat sheets of monetary policy, fiscal policy, exchange rate. I hope this led to an increase in conceptual clarity with respect to these topics, and you will be better able to handle all the questions that will come in your prelims examination. Now, all these cheat sheets will be available in the Telegram group of UPSCprep.com. The link to the Telegram group will also be available in the description of this video. Now, I'll also provide a list of 16 questions which has been asked in the previous years. So what I want you guys to do is also look at those questions and try to solve those questions, and share your marks. At least let me see that if you have more confidence, you are able to tackle those questions with more clarity. And that will be all. Thank you very much, and all the very best for your prelims examination. Thank you.